afternoon, church family and friends. Thank you for coming back to be a part of this afternoon's Pastor's Book Club, where we will feature acclaimed author Kris Henning, The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Our Black Youth. We're in for a great conversation as we examine our black youth, our criminal justice system, and offer solutions for what our community, houses of faith, families, our criminal justice system, and community partners can do to make sure that we do no harm to the wonderful and amazing youth that are in our community, and many are in our churches today. And so this promises to be an engaging conversation, and we want to encourage you, for those who are online, to please prepare your questions. We'll look online, and we will make sure we have a space to hear from you, raise your questions toward the end of our conversation with the author. I am pleased today, in just a minute we're going to introduce our author, but I'm here to co-facilitate this conversation, this dialogue, is our very own Justin Thomas, who is a visual content creator and graphic designer studying visual communications and digital media arts with a concentration in advertising design at Bowie State University, HBCU. He sees the richness and power of visual design to communicate the big ideas, evoke emotions, create connections, and to build community. In fact, this is his last year as an undergrad. He will be graduating in May with a bachelor's degree. Come on, let's give God praise. Even in his youth, and given also in his very young life, he has been very productive. He's interned at Adobe, the Washington Area Community Investment Fund, and the Office of Greek Life at Bowie State University. He also provided pro bono graphic design work for a faith community and 3 startups, including our church. Recently, Justin was inducted into the Collegiate 100 chapter for the 100 Black Men of Prince George's County at Bowie State University. Come on, let's give God praise. And so we thank God that in just a month or so, a little over a month, he will graduate with a Bachelor of Science and completing his coursework for his Google UX User Design Professional Certificate. We are so proud of you, and we are looking forward to some amazing things to come. And we know that your mom, Stephanie Thomas Gordon, and your stepdad, Charles Gordon, are very proud of you, as well as your large village here at 19th Street Baptist Church. I want to call on a chair of our Fruit of the Spirit ministry. We've had a wonderful day. She and the team have worked so hard to prepare for today. She has an excellent review in the epistle article that you can still look at. We encourage you to do so. And she will come and share with us the occasion for today's Deacon Johnny Love.
Thank you, Pastor. It is indeed an important aspect of the Koinonia community to prepare its youth for the days to come. And so we are very appreciative of our guest author, who has worked in the field of criminal justice for quite some time. And as I said, I felt like I knew Kris, honestly. I just reading her bio and studying that, I said, this could be the thing that we can do as a community of Fruit of the Spirit, connecting with the Pastor's Book Club, and then making it a part of building our community. Now, what we're going to do, we have a donor that has donated 5 books. And what we want to do for those who are listening, that if you are a college graduate this year, other than our guests, or other than our panelists, or you are a graduate of high school, if you are a person working in criminal justice, if you are another college graduate, or if you are working in the correctional system, please let us know by putting that in the chat section of the virtual program that you are one of those individuals, and you will have a free copy of the book. So at this time now, I'm going to let Pastor offer a word of prayer for us, and then we will begin with our program for today. Thank you. Kris, thank you so much for coming.
Much for having me. It's really an honor.
Thank you. And we're blessed. We're blessed to know that women, black women in this country are so talented and gifted and just doing their work quietly. But we're just very appreciative that you have decided to be with us today. So thank you. And remember, now, if you are a college graduate, if you're a high school graduate, if you're a person working in the criminal justice system, if you're a college graduate, again, and if you're a high school graduate and want to get one of our free books given by a gracious donor, we would love for you to tell us in the chat area. Thank you.
Thank you, Deacon Love. Let us open with prayer. God, we thank you for bringing us to this time where we can both focus on both head, heart, and spirit. You've caused us to be as wise as serpents and as harmless as a dove. We thank you for the work and the brilliance of our author today, Sister Henning. We thank you for bringing her to 19th Street Baptist Church, and we look forward to an opportunity to learn, to stretch our minds, to think of new ways that the church might be engaged in our community, with our youth, with the result of helping them to develop positive, affirming identities, and help them to understand how brilliant and blessed they are, and that there is nothing that they cannot achieve. And so, Lord, we thank you. Bless this time. Bless those who are on the way, those who are in the virtual space, all who need to be a part of this conversation. And it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. I want to call on Sister Cheryl Cashin, one of our members, who will come now and introduce our author.
Good morning, church family. It is so wonderful to be here in person. I've been looking forward to this for a couple months. It was a rough week watching a brilliant jurist be pummeled and mistreated, and coming here this morning for service was a balm. So I'm just delighted to be here. I'm also here not just as a member of 19th Street Baptist Church, but as a member of the Pastor's Book Club Planning Committee. I think I've found the perfect ministry for me, Pastor. And after I had the wonderful experience of presenting my own book in the fall, I was asked who I thought we should invite next, and it was an easy choice. I'm delighted to introduce my friend, my colleague, and a sister who has truly been anointed by God to be a voice and an advocate for our children, whom we all see as geniuses, as assets, as contributors to society, as people to be loved and uplifted. And Sister Law Professor Kristen Nicole Henning does all of that. She is the Bloom Professor of Law at Georgetown Law. We're colleagues, we both teach there. Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic. She has written an awesome book, and I have to say, I feel like I had some role in this. She came to me, this is your first, you've written book chapters, but this is her first book authored solely by her, right? And she asked for some advice. I gave her humble advice. This girl knocked it out of the park. Her very first book, she gets reviewed on the front page of the New York Times. And let me tell you, for authors, that is like, you know, I don't know, winning the Super Bowl or something like that. And I have to say, you know, 90% of selling books is having a wonderful title. The title, The Rage of Innocence, could not have been more brilliant. But more to the point, this book is so necessary, and it's part of, is it 25 years now? You know, it's part of 25 years of advocacy. In her career, among the many things she has done, she served as a public defender, right? Public defenders, as Ketanji Brown Jackson was, if she is confirmed, when she is confirmed, she will be the first public defender, former public defender in American history to serve on the court. And to have a public servant who chooses to represent not just you know, any client, but particularly represent young people, juveniles who are trapped in the criminal justice system, to denigrate that is an obscenity. So I want to applaud you for that. You have continued. When any state or locality wants to do better with their criminal justice system, who do they go to? They go to our guest today. She's developed all kinds of programs, toolkits, advice, consulting to help the juvenile justice system be more humane. And we thank you for that, and we look forward to hearing your brilliance today, my sister. I give you all my love, and thank you for coming to be with us today.
Right back at you, Sister Carol. Just, if I can take a privilege just to say thank you publicly. She is not kidding when she says that she was a tremendous help. She gets a shout out in the book in the back. You know, Sister Cheryl, we see you as a thought leader on race in America, and teaching us how to write in ways that are accessible to everyone, and that comes from you. So I just want to say thank you so much for that.
Thank you
really
so much.
Appreciate you. And also to Deacon Love, just absolutely, I agree. I feel like I know you, like you're my sister girl, right? So I so appreciate you and all your organization, and service this morning was beautiful. Definitely, the Spirit of the Lord is upon us. So thank
Wonderful.
you, Pastor Roberts and Justin, for being
welcome.
here. Thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you. I want to. We've already kind of begun this work, and thank you, Sister Cashin, and it really has been a privilege to have you as a part of the planning committee, and Deacon Love, one of Deacon Love's ideas to pull in some of our members, and thank you for bringing Sister Henning to us. And the timing of your work, I think, is important for us today as we look at what is going on in our community and our society, particularly as it impacts our youth in the juvenile justice system. As we look at our churches, as the preacher shared this morning, there's this mass exodus. Many of our institutions are having a hard time connecting with our young people, and I think there are great insights in your work that can help us in that process. And Justin Thomas is going to lead us with the first question, then we'll jump right into our conversation.
So, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Like I said. I just wanted to reiterate that when I was reading the book, like the intro was enticing. We can talk about it later, but one of the names, Eric, and what he went through, I said, okay, well, you know, I feel like in law school, I'm about to learn more about what's happening with Black youth. But my first question to you is, what book or books inspired you to write The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth?
Wow, he starts off strong. I would say Anything and Everything by Toni Morrison, right? Which is like, you know, largely fiction. Her large body of fiction, she also writes extensively in social commentary. But the reason I say Toni Morrison is because she's about truth-telling, right? And I know Sister Cheryl talks about that too, but writing in a way that exposes the realities and the challenges of Black America. In a way that tells stories, right? That's a narrative, so that people can see themselves in those stories, right? As a child, right? So I think about Bluest Eye, and I think I just so identify with the narrative and with the story, but with the young girl in the story in particular. And so I wanted to write a book, although it's not fiction, that distinctly calls to mind my own life experience and the life experiences of young people. So I would say, yeah, Toni Morrison, maybe even Bluest Eye. That's a great question.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. As we think about Toni Morrison and Bluest Eye and some of the influences that have impacted your writing, you share in your work, you talk about one of your first experiences and first memories of being in juvenile court. And you were a freshman in Durham, North Carolina, while interning at the district attorney's office. And you saw this image of these 8 boys, primarily Black and Latino, who were in belly chains and shackles as they were escorted down the hallway by the corrections officer. And you said how that image reminded you of Alex Haley's Roots. And it was an image that invoked in you outrage and anger and frustration in terms of how our youth and young people are being treated. But it also inspired you to go to law school and to be an advocate for children. As you kind of fast forward 25 or so years later, representing hundreds of clients, what image best reflects now the way Black youth are being treated?
Wow. It's really sad. What a painful question, because the image that immediately popped in my head was Tamir Rice. Really, and that's going to sound very extreme, right?
Can you share with some people who may not know who Tamir Rice
Absolutely.
is? Yeah.
So Tamir Rice is the 12-year-old boy in Cleveland, Ohio, who is doing what every other child in America does, playing, right? A fundamental feature of childhood, right? Exercise, fresh air, stress relief. So he's playing with a toy gun in a park, public park in Cleveland, Ohio. There is a phone call from a civilian who calls to say there is a Black male with a gun, probably fake, probably a child. Police race onto the scene, and he is shot and killed in less than 3 seconds of the police officer's arrival. And for me, that's the image in reality and metaphorically for how Black children are treated today. And I say it's such a painful image because police aren't killing, Black children in droves, but the violence that we do to Black children psychologically, emotionally, through over-policing, hyper-surveillance is the same kind of thing. So it's a slow death, it's a mental death, right? It's a trauma that Black children experience. And so for me, that was the first image that pops in my head. And, and I hate that also, another image that pops in my head is Trayvon Martin, who was, killed by a civilian, right? I don't even want to call his name, but Mr. Zimmerman, right?
Mr. Zimmerman.
But the reason why I wanted to bring that out, because I think about that as policing as proxy. So when we have this conversation about policing, it's not just about policing in a blue uniform, it's also about the ways in which all of us in America police Black children, right? Even within our Black community, if we want to be honest about it, right? And maybe, get into some of those nuances, but we all are policing Black children when we walk down the street and we're afraid of them.
That's powerful. Justin and I were talking about this as it relates to the Tamir Rice situation, right? Which was a toy gun, right? And I've had this conversation, so my son has been pressing me about getting laser tag guns, right? And so after years, I finally decided to purchase the laser tag guns, right? And so he wanted to play outside with his friends in the community, most of whom were white, Hispanic. And so I had to have a conversation with him why he could not just go outside and just play with the laser tag guns without having an adult present. And he couldn't quite understand it. You know, I'm trying to have this conversation with an 8-year-old, right? And certainly some of his white friends were like, why would somebody mistake a toy gun as we're running around for a real gun? I said, it unfortunately has happened. And so at that very young age, we're in a way circumscribing, limiting, placing all these barriers and trauma on our young people because they can't be free to be children like many of their white counterparts. And if you could just say a little bit more, and Justin, if you want to jump, but just a little bit more about this trauma and what impact it is having on our children to make them live in such ways where they can't be totally free to be children.
Yeah, there is now a growing body of research documenting the extraordinary psychological trauma that Black children experience when they live in heavily surveilled communities or always have to be on guard from police officers, you know, stopping them, frisking them, asking them, where are you going, where are you coming from, civilians, you know, calling 911 on them. And the research shows that young folks, Black and brown children too, who live in these communities or experience this, report high rates of fear, anxiety, depression, some of them hopelessness. They feel, they become hypervigilant, meaning that they're always on guard, not trusting police officers. And really, in my mind, what is so tragic about that is that distrust of a police officer in a blue uniform transfers over to other adult authority figures, like teachers, counselors, other people who might be allies for them. So it is really, it is profound in ways that I think we don't think about. The research also shows that that people experience, young people, Black children experience this trauma even when they're not the direct target of that police contact and violence, but just by hearing about it, witnessing it among friends, family, and other people who they are close to, or even watching it on the internet and television is enough to create that same kind of trauma. So I say to folks all the time, think about what, I ask people when I talk to audiences, think about where you were and how you felt when you watched George Floyd being killed, right? You know, in front of us all. And then I say, imagine what it must be like to be a Black or brown child and know that that could happen to you. And so it's really a deep-seated psychological trauma that really lives on. And you talked about the role of parents. I devote, you know, an entire chapter, chapter 5, this notion of Black adolescent identity development. It's like the most important thing that happens during our teenage years is trying to figure out who we are, right? Who we can become and how we engage with other people. And so this conversation about, can I play? Right? Can I go outside? Can I be a teenager? Right? And how do people view me is so critical and so difficult for Black parents to navigate. That in and of itself is a source of trauma.
Just to piggyback off of what he was saying about his child, I remember as a kid, one of the top toys that I wanted was a Nerf. And it was like, if you don't know what a Nerf is, it's this huge, colorful gun that doesn't have any bullets, but it has little darts, which I guess looks like bullets. But I remember asking my mom if I can have one, and she was like, no, like straight out no. I also remember we lived across the street from CVS, and you know, CVS has the little toy sections, and this has to be when I was probably like 2nd grade, but they had a little pistol that was, I think it was purple. And I asked her again, and she was like, no. So I didn't really understand as, you know, an 8 through 10-year-old, why couldn't I have this toy? Because, you know, I was doing good in school, and I had A's and B's, and I was like, of course, why not? Can I get this? But at the time, my mom was a single mother, so that's a whole bunch of stress on herself, trying to manage raising a young boy, but also having the thought of, okay, he has this toy gun, but that could be the end of his life if he's at a park, like Tamir Rice was. And she wouldn't know if I was, coming home at night. But you brought up the fact of officers, and that actually leads me to my second question. So, Black children's relationship with law officers is very different from their counterparts. What I took from the reading is that these police altercations can lead to jail time or death. Based on what you were just saying, what actions could law enforcement take to promote school safety and justice and reduce bias?
Yeah, so you really touch on such an important point, this notion of school safety, right? And that's what everybody wants, right? Everybody wants their children to be safe, but really what I say over and over again, and this is really important, it goes to your question about what can police officers do. We as a country have bought into this idea that the only way to achieve safety, school safety and community safety, is through traditional law enforcement approaches, right? And that now schools, students, I imagine you did, walk into school and enter in through a metal detector, right?
Actually,
You did not?
I did not.
Lucky him.
I never had that experience. I do remember my middle school when it was rebuilt because it had a fire. We did have security, but they reminded me of like old uncles, so they didn't really have guns present. But what I do now know, like after graduating high school, I see the schools having police around them and metal detectors. And I didn't have that experience, but now I do know that it's present.
It is now, and so it's just so interesting because I've been, think about where to gauge, like when is this transition happening? We could have a whole conversation about the historical evolution of police and schools, which is a very racialized history, definitely, in the book. And so, look, it may be even worth saying a word about that history and then talking about what are the alternatives, right? So I think that might be, so I will tell you all, I really, for the longest time, bought into the often repeated story that we have police in schools today because of the mass shooting in Columbine, Colorado in 1999. But as I dug deeper and reading for this book, and I really felt like, I should have known this, but the first police in schools appeared in 1939 in Indianapolis, when there was the earliest even inkling of a conversation about the possibility of segregation, of desegregating schools, right? Or of, commingling children. Then the police in schools increased exponentially in the civil rights era, right? And they were sent under the guise of safe passage, creating a safe passage during desegregation after Brown versus Board of Education. But we know from the iconic photographs and from the historical record that far too often police were an impediment to meaningful integration of schools. Fast forward to 1990s, right? By 1991, we have so many police in schools that we have the National Association of School Resource Officers is created in 1991. In 1994, this is also really important, the federal government has created the Federal Cops in Schools framework. That is the framework that allows the federal government, the United States, to funnel in dollars into the local and state schools to increase the presence of schools. What's happening in the 1990s? The 1990s is this moment of the super predator era, this pseudo-scientific myth, which predicted that young, beautiful black children like yourself were going to run amok and rape, maim, and kill all of America, right? Became a threat to white America. That pseudoscientific super predator myth was disproven, but both disproven and withdrawn pretty soon thereafter. But now we have school resource officers just proliferating schools. By 1999, when Columbine happens, the mass shooting in Columbine, Colorado, the federal government does increase spending for cops in schools, but where do those police officers go? They go to schools and state and publicly funded schools with a high percentage of black and brown children, a disproportionate number of black and brown children. So what you see, this really goes to your point, is what we see in our country today. There are pockets right here in the District of Columbia, and just all over the country, both in rural and urban spaces, where there is a high presence of police officers in schools. And so I will tell you, every child that I represent in this book, that I talk about in this book, has gone to a school where they walk in the front door, you see metal detectors, you see police officers, armed guards, and the like. And so the question is, so you've seen that?
Yeah, my daughter goes to
see?
here in D.C.
It's amazing.
Metal detector, you have to put your items on the belt, on the conveyor belt before you can go in the building.
Before you go in, right? Yeah. That's absolutely right. Mm-hmm. And so you're already asking the questions like, well, how do we get to public safety? We have decided somehow in our country, we have bought into the idea that what we just described is the only way to make this work now. And the reality is it's not true. The evidence shows that there are many strategies for public health that are both less psychologically traumatizing for black children and more effective. And so we're talking about a public health approach to school safety, right? So what do we do with officers? We need to help them understand. We need to relieve them of these traditional law enforcement, some of these traditional law enforcement duties inside schools, and invest our dollars in a public health approach that is attentive to restorative justice, conflict resolution, social emotional learning, which teaches one empathy, compassion, conflict. We need vocational opportunities. We need a very large continuum of mental health providers in schools. So there's a number of ways, and even in schools where there is evidence of violence, there is evidence that violence interrupters and credible messengers are effective alternatives. So.
This is great. I want to just continue along the same lines as we talk about SROs in schools, and you also talk about the important work of youth activism in this movement to kind of create police-free zones in schools. And I want you to kind of talk a little bit more about that and some of the things that local governments and police districts are doing to reimagine, the role of SROs. That instead of trying to make them wear kind of a one-size-fits-all approach where we ask them to be a counselor, a teacher, and an officer, that we need to limit and refocus their roles on particular, I think you talk about it, kind of very serious behavioral issues in schools, not minor infractions. And you talk about kind of, in some cases, we need to even move perhaps SROs out of the school building itself, right, to create a different perception and environment. Can you speak to some of those districts? And you talk about Washington State as a great kind of flagship for what the country should be doing. Why do you lift Washington State up as a model for that? And what are some of the things that we can learn from these examples for how to best utilize SROs in our schools?
Yeah, so there is a national movement and with international support called the Police Free Schools Movement. And I have to say that the best leaders of that movement are the young people. So that's where you started, this notion of youth activism and getting in spaces and sitting at the table with young people who can help us understand the trauma and help us think of the alternatives. And I think that's what's really critical. And that gives me, the greatest hope is young people like Justin speaking out. And what's fascinating, you talk about youth activism, after the shooting in Parkland, right, in Florida, right, young people spoke up and they said, we want to be safe. We don't want mass shootings in our school, but guess what? We don't want police officers to get us there. right? And so they have wonderful ideas of thinking about mental health services and that continuum of mental health services. And you see that across the country. The police-free schools movement is actually not a new movement. It's been in play in places like Oakland, California, you know, for well over a decade. And it wasn't, though, until George Floyd was killed that you began to see traction across the country on police-free schools. And what you see, you asked about some of these models, is that what you see in some of the states is when they advocate for police-free schools, they're advocating very explicitly that the dollars that the city, the local governments are paying for police be reimagined or reinvested in these alternatives, these mental health alternatives, these violence interrupters, right? That's really a wonderful example. Folks who are more interested in this work, the Advancement Project has really done some great work right here in our nation's capital around that. And then, you know, why did I lift up Washington State? So you're absolutely right. In the book, I try to give, you know, examples of schools that have a police-free schools movement. Washington State is a little different, right? So what I lift up there is that our lawmakers have a role to play, right? So we've got community work, we've got youth work, but we also have lawmakers who can make a difference. And what Washington State said was, well, we're not going to dictate to you whether you have police in schools, though they write a little memoranda that is a commentary that accompanies the statute and says we don't recommend it. But for those schools that do choose to have it, there are some minimum safeguards, right? And those minimum safeguards include a memorandum of understanding between the police department and the school. And one of the single most important things is it says that police officers should not be called upon to engage in routine school discipline. Yes. And so my book is really heavily about the criminalization of normal adolescent behaviors. Those behaviors that every single one of us did when we were kids or that our own children have done. That's what Washington State says, we're not doing that, right? And it gets to your point too about shrinking the size, right? This over-reliance on police officers to do things, one, that they're not trained to do, that they have no business in doing, and not particularly, you know, even entered the field to do, right? So that means, you know, working with kids with mental health, drug addictions, normal adolescent, you know, impulsivity, none of that should be at play. So this idea is to shrink I say we need to shrink our juvenile justice system, our juvenile legal system. I struggle to call it a justice system, right? To shrink the juvenile legal system by 80%. So that, and this is what you were getting, so that we're only left with 20%. So you talk about what do we do with police officers? We need to reallocate that budget, 80% of that budget, into community-based, investing in young people, families, communities. Right? With all of the resources that they need, and then really keep those 20% of those dollars in dealing with serious violent crime, right? And, you know, nuanced, careful work, right?
You talk about this debate about, I love it, the hairstyles, the sagging pants, the dress codes, and how it kind of reflects this larger or broader conversation about Black respectability. That if you exercise a degree of self-control, Black youth, if you discard parts of yourself that are offensive or threatening to white people, then you can have an easy pathway into successful careers in schools and neighborhoods and social opportunities. However, in your text, many of the youth you profile were doing things that were not doing things, if you will, that would draw attention to themselves, right? They were not wearing provocative clothes. They were trying to avoid trouble, and they were socializing with the right people. They were still profiled, they were still mistreated, and they were still arrested. So how do we, because I think this is such an important conversation in our community about the role of personal responsibility and social responsibility. How do we begin to pierce this brick wall or steel wall of Black respectability, which unfairly places the responsibility for mistreatment on our Black children and parents, right? and then help to focus our energy on the system that dehumanizes them?
Right. Oh, what a beautiful question. And I got to say, in the moment in which we find ourselves, it's both and, right? And so when I say both and, number one, it's a cultural shift that we have to demand, right? And that we, give young people, young Black children, a safe space in which to understand the reality, but demand something different, right? Getting them at the table in these conversations is critically important. While at the same time, you got to be a parent, and every parent has got to teach a child to be safe. So this question about respectability is a whole nother, it's a whole nother mountain to climb. But I think about respectability in a few ways. I think about respectability in three ways, and I say we as a Black community have to be careful what we mean by that, right? And I think that there is the largest cohort of what we really mean when we talk about respectability is just the reality that Black parents have to do whatever they can to keep their kids safe. I think that's a huge piece of it. So, pull your pants up, don't draw attention, all the things that you said, comply with an officer, even when you feel disrespected or inappropriately treated, because I need to get you home safe, right? I don't even use the word respectability for that context, right? That's one of the three categories. In my mind, that's a survival instinct, right? And I think I will pause there with that regard and to say that I think it's really important for Black parents to teach that while simultaneously teaching Black pride, right? It's got to go hand in hand. Do what you got to do to keep safe, but that does not mean that you are less than, right? Yes. Because I have you complying with the police officer to get home, I need you to know that when you walk away, you are as strong and as beautiful and as powerful and as humane as you were when you entered that encounter. And we as a community, we as a family, we will figure out other ways to address that, right? But in the meantime, get home. But I think we have to say that. I think what happens too often is that we say that and we leave the child hanging, right? As to what's the alternative, like teaching them how to give voice. So that's one aspect of what I think people talk about as respectability. I just call it survival. I think there is a tiny, tiny piece of respectability that gives me the most pause, which is somehow if we think that if we make ourselves assimilate, right, into, a white supremacist world, and we give up creativity and culture and our music and all of those things, that somehow we're going to be safe. And that's what I talk about in the book, and that's what you say. That has never made us safe. You know what? Black children showed up at the civil rights protest in their Sunday best, and they still, got hosed down, right? You can be lynched in a suit. So that, but that's a small piece, I think, of, what we're really talking about. And so I think the notion of respectability, politics is really, we have to be careful with it. And I think what it is for me, it's empowering. I actually really just had this conversation with my cousins, if any of you all are watching. My cousins last night about, we get to choose. This is a little bit about code switching, right? I get to choose who I want to be, how I want to enter a space. So long as I'm not told, I'm not mandated how I show up, if that makes any sense, right? Yes. I want to be able to show up, like, I say, so this is the last thing I'll say about this. This point about the criminalization of Black adolescence, right? This is what we're talking about. I say to people when I talk, remember what you cared about when you were a teenager. As a teenager, you cared about the clothes that you wore, the music that you listened to, your friends that you sat with in the cafeteria, how you styled your hair. All of that stuff mattered then, and it matters now, and you add social media to that. And all of that is what you care about. Well, think about it, right? Think about the hippie era. People walked around in tie-dye t-shirts and bell-bottoms, and nobody criminalized that, even though they were associated with hallucinogens and, all other, manner of drug, marijuana. Think about the all black attire, goth attire, right? And the straight black hair. We've never criminalized that. Think about Doc Martens today with the red shoelaces. Hello, right? Skinheads, right? White supremacists. And that's been associated with violence. Have we ever criminalized any of that?
That's right.
No. But yet we have criminalized sagging pants. No, I don't want to see anybody else's underwear. But it is the only item of clothing in American history. That's a criminal offense on the books, right? Let's think about that, right? So that's what we're, that's what we're up against. And that's what I'm saying about being able to enter a space, right? By my own choosing and showing up the way I want to, right? That's what it means to be an adolescent. Testing limits, being creative, and so we have to allow that. And so I worry sometimes when we talk about respectability that we lose that.
I wish this book was around when I was in high school. During my time, I was in the debate club, and we had to travel to different, more prominent high school than I was attending at the time. And then we also had to go compete at Harvard and Yale. And I remember, thank you. I remember having a conversation with my debate coach. His name was Mr. Grisanti. He was my English teacher. He was cool. He was a Republican, but
it's cool. But did y'all notice the butt? No, just kidding.
I did like Mr. Grisanti. He was a nice man. But I remember having a conversation with him because at the time, all the competitions were in winter, and naturally you grow out your hair so you stay warm. And I didn't pick up the it's not the hatred, but I'm forgetting the term right now, the microaggression of the comment. All of my members were black on the team, and I remember him saying, like, you have to trim your hair down a little bit because it was too wild. And to me, it's like, okay, well, I didn't pick it up at the time at 16, 17, but now that I look back at it, it's like, what do you mean by wild? Like, is this too big, too puffy, too curly? And then you talk about code switching, and I definitely had to do that when you go up to these campuses that, there's college advisors watching you, there's children there are white and their parents, are rich. And so you really have to tread carefully on who you were talking about and talking to. So I would have to switch my voice up like this, and they couldn't really tell that I went to a school in the Bronx. And when I said I went to a school in the Bronx, they were like, "You went to a school in the Bronx?" Because to them, they went to these big private schools in Connecticut and Massachusetts, and it was. I just wish I had the time to read it during this time. But I did make sure during my time in debate, most of my topics was on Black lives. The most recent one, my last one, was actually based off of Philando Castile and making sure that police officers' cameras were mandatory. Because at the time it wasn't mandatory, you can turn it on and off. But I wanted to make sure that my bill was passed. But my next question to you, I remember reading a chapter about Jamal. And Jamal, just a little spoiler, Jamal was defiant. And he wasn't scared. He was basically harassed by the police. He was arrested, but he talked back, specifically to the two white officers. All right, just want to make sure. The two white officers, and that there was a black officer there. And now he really went in on them, and he didn't, have any fear on it. So my question to you is that from a defense attorney standpoint, what information can you share to navigate unexpected police encounters?
Ooh, that's a beautiful question. So I want to do, yes.
Right before you answer the question, if you could, those of you who have questions in the chat, please indicate and put those in the chat now. In a few minutes, we're going to go to the audience questions, and those in the sanctuary, if you have questions, the mic will circulate for you as well. Thank you.
Excellent. So I'll say two things. One, I just want to commend you, the story that you just told about when you have an opportunity to speak in debate club, raising racial justice issues and advocating for a position of reform. And your position of reform was the need for body-worn camera to be turned on by police officers. And now that is really a standard fare in most police departments. And it's young voices like yours that make that happen.
Yes.
So I just can't thank you enough. And just how incredibly important it is to have young voices in public spaces in front of lawmakers having these conversations. And so it's so interesting you asked this, because the tying your experience together with Jamal's story. So in the book, for those of you who haven't read it, I talk about a kid that I represented named Jamal who gets stopped in Washington, D.C. He's, going to visit a friend at a local apartment, and just as he's approaching the door of the apartment, a police officer sort of calls out to him and says, "Hey, can I talk to you for a second?" Right? And he turns, to walk away like, you have no right, right? This is what your point is. Like, you have no right to talk to me. I haven't done anything. I'm going about my business. And, as he begins to leave, the officer physically grabs him and pulls him back, ultimately wrestles him to the ground, puts him in handcuffs, and leaves him in the dirt. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever for this kid to be in the dirt. He's now in handcuffs. He's not a threat to anybody else. Doesn't even matter what he's done. He's completely immobilized. And so Jamal tries to sit himself up. And this is what Justin is getting at, is you describe it as courage, speaking out with no fear. And he recognized the absolute dehumanization with which he was being treated. And he keeps saying to the officer, just get me out of the dirt. You all have, he's really articulate. Like, you have no reason whatsoever to have me in the dirt. And then he begins to just continue to just pontificate as if to say, not even as if to say to these officers, you do black people wrong. Mm-hmm. You treat black people wrong. He goes on to say, black people are smarter than white people. It's almost comical if it weren't so tragic. It's just a fabulous exchange that he's having all while he's in handcuffs. And every time he scoots himself up onto the sidewalk, they kick him and knock him back into the dirt. And so he keeps speaking out. And that's what's so powerful about the story, and how there's an older black woman who comes out on the porch and she pretends to sweep. And she's watching, and she said, he at one point, Jamal calls out to him and says, "Do you see how they're treating me? Do you see?" Yes. It's just so powerful because it shows how, this gets to your point, how conflicted the black community is. Yes. Because she says, "Let me be clear, I don't want boys selling drugs in my neighborhood, but I also," and she turns to the police officers, "but y'all gonna treat our boys fair." Right? Yes. All in one moment. And it's just so powerful. And so what I love about your story and the juxtaposition, Justin, of your story in Debate Club with Jamal's story, because what I talk about in that chapter 5, this adolescent identity development, that some of our young black boys and girls will have a space and an opportunity to speak out in traditional forms. Right? Debate club, coming to city council to testify, writing an op-ed, right? Voting in an election when they're old enough. But then there are kids like Jamal who won't have those opportunities for a variety of reasons. The intersection of poverty, right? And then once you get a criminal record, then you're prohibited from voting. And so those kids also, though, any child with an ounce of self-worth, an ounce of dignity, right? Resist the labels that are imposed upon them. And so it sometimes looks like what you saw Jamal doing, right? And, it's Jamal sounding aggressive. It's Jamal sounding loud. It's Jamal, some of my kids using profanity. But that's their way of speaking out. right? And that we should, privilege that opportunity in the same way we privilege debate club and traditional voting. So it's such a powerful story. I thank you for sharing your story, because the marriage of those two I think is really, really powerful.
Thank you.
I wanted to just ask, as we open it up to our audience, both in person and virtually, you give a great update on your reunion in this text. You talk about kind of meeting up with Eric again and your reunion with Eric. And I wanted to know, he has quite a different story. In fact, we also wanted to know, we were talking about this, Justin and I, Jamal, and any update on his family and situation. But so you have Eric on the one hand, and then you have Kevin, who has to leave. Right? But Eric finds a way to stay, and he develops these strategies for survival and resistance, which also causes him to be surveilled by the police, right? And so I want to, as I'm thinking about this question, is if you can provide an update, right? And other clients that you've worked with in terms of how they're doing, we would love to kind of get a sense, and if you can just update everyone who these individuals are, but to kind of Eric and other clients. But I've also, the next question I want to ask has to do with these horrible kind of images, right? And you talk about, throughout this kind of narrative, you talk about white power and white privilege and the ways in which this criminalization of black youth happens in a culture that needs to maintain white power and white privilege. And these wonderful reforms you outline at the end of the book, which I think you're focusing on social emotional learning, conflict resolution, restorative justice. That's a particular audience that you're speaking to, right? Not necessarily, maybe so, the ones who would lynch or execute the youngest black person or person in this country to be executed, that you talk about as well, the execution. What is your message to them, to that audience that is filled with rage and hatred, right? That feels that it's necessary to continue to treat black and brown youth this way to protect white privilege and white power. What's the message to them to say, hey, it's important for us to move to a space where we are treating black children and brown children just like you want your children to be treated? What will motivate them to want to be a part of this movement of change and reform?
So you realize that was a three-part
I know,
question
I
with
know.
5 subparts. No, I was teasing you. Actually, I just had to say that because I do that too. I'm actually going to start backwards on purpose because I want to end on a higher note.
Sure.
And I think that last question, which will be my first answer, doesn't necessarily have the answer that everybody wants, which is, right? So this notion of how do we answer the folks who have the most hatred, right?
Yes.
And who are the most, if you will, self-interested in preserving white power and white supremacy. And here's my answer. I think that somebody told me this once, and I found it very, very helpful, which is think about 20-60-20, meaning that 20% of the folks that I talk to about a conversation, about a topic like this, are already with me, already get it, already on board for these reforms. There's 60% of the people that I can talk to, that we can go out in spaces at Debate Club, and we can begin to move them towards the position of humanity for black children. And then there's 20% of the people we're never going to get. And I don't ever want to say never, but I think we have to own and recognize the fact that those folks who are most invested in maintaining that white supremacy may never change. from a book like this, a conversation like that, and that I have to understand that. Somebody told me, I don't know if you got the same advice, Sister Cheryl, but like if you're trying to write a book for everybody, you're going to write for nobody. And so going for the audience that we can shift the most. And so I'm going for that 60%, right?
Okay.
Those folks, and even that includes some white folks who actually have a vested interest in preserving resources for themselves. Some of those people fall in that because when they see themselves in their childhood, right, and they see, if they can, here's an example. I think about, discrimination, honestly, against, LGBT brothers and sisters, and how Republicans have slowly shifted, right, their ideology and their, tolerance, if you will, because their own children have increasingly identified. And so then they begin to show grace and tolerance, and then they realize, they're human too, right? Like everybody, has a place in the space. And so I think part of what I'm doing, is saying that I want you to see your own kid in this. This could be your child, right? And so that helps move. So I hope that helps.
Yes.
But I'm not necessarily going to go for that last 20%. I just got to own that.
Okay.
So that was one of your questions. I think this notion of the criminalization of youth in an effort to preserve power and resources is related. Sort of they were related to that. But I think it's a slightly different question, which is this notion of resource allocation. As long as we as a society believe in scarcity, we're so invested in this notion of scarcity, and that if Justin succeeds, then I necessarily fail. And so I think that part of what we see in contemporary America, particularly with young people, being more multicultural and working together across the lines. I think about Parkland, the shooting in Florida, and the way kids across, racial demographics work together on these questions. That if I think some of this is about, it really is in your house. It's like the resource allocation issue isn't as divided as we think it is. So I'm not sure if that really gets at your question, bridging lines at this younger generation, in my mind, around these critical questions, can break down some of the white supremacy around some of these questions. I also, in my head, immediately popped up with some counter examples like Kyle Rittenhouse, as a really critical example. But then the last thing you asked me was about hope. It's about hope. It's about Eric and about all these other kids. So let me make a global comment about all the kids in the book. So I think all the kids in the book are in different spaces. So understanding my role as a defense attorney for children, a lot of folks don't want to come back and talk to me ever again because I represent for them the worst moment in their lives, if that makes any sense, right? Meaning, and I talk about this when I get to the end of the book, and I say, with Eric, so Eric is a kid that I talk about at the beginning of the book. All right, he's a kid who gets criminalized for being creative, making what looked like a Molotov cocktail. When he was 13 years old, you guys, 13 years old, he makes what looks like a Molotov cocktail. He gets arrested, expelled from school, and locked, and sent to juvenile court for 9 months. 10 years later, in writing this book, I go back and find him. And that's what you're talking about. And I was terrified. And I was terrified to go try to find him because many of my clients, as defenders, I get along beautifully with my clients, but a lot of them, they don't want to be reminded of that moment of trauma. So I have to be careful about finding old clients. But I came up with some that I wanted to go find, and Eric was one of them. And it turns out, just as you said, you noted at the end of the book, is that he's an activist. He's a youth activist. And so when I found him, and I found his mother, and I found his sister, they were so proud of him and all that he had done because he was protesting after the killing of George Floyd, just like we talked about earlier.
That's right.
And he brilliantly decided that the way he could be helpful was to feed the people who were protesting right here in Washington, D.C. Right? So he bought himself isn't that beautiful? He bought himself literally, it's like $50, buys himself a grill, some folding chairs, and goes and sits out. And he would say, it was like I would see he would call them the old ladies, the old ladies out there speaking their piece, right? And he wanted to be able to help them so that they could stay out there longer and speak their piece. And so that's what he did. And he did that for you know how long the protests lasted, how they were set up outside, the White House for quite some time. He was out there the duration of that. And so that's what I talk about hope. It's the experiencing a trauma at 13 and being resilient. I talk a lot in chapter 12 about the resilience of adolescence, so that when we provide for kids, the resilience of adolescence, they can thrive and they can be spokespersons for these critical issues. So that's Eric. Jamal, I am not in touch with anymore. Kevin, I very much love Kevin. Kevin he features a lot in this book. And like I said, he left DC. But you also should know Eric left DC too. Eric left DC for probably about 3 years and came back to get away. And so this is not a DC story. So my book has a lot of my clients, all of whom are from DC. But I really want to be clear, this isn't just a DC story. And so in the book, I tell a lot of the high-profile stories of other kids, right, from other states, so that we could see this is not just a DC story, and that kids don't have to leave their hometown, but that they can speak up and, have an opportunity right here at Bowie State. Go to college, HBCU in the area, and speak out around these local issues and local politics. So.
You want to raise your question about Ketanji Brown?
Oh, yes. Okay. I thought we were going to move into the virtual audience. So this is going to be my last question.
Okay.
But over the past week, we watched the hearing confirmation for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. And before Judge Brown Jackson became a judge, he was a defense attorney, and he was also the vice chair of the United States Sentencing Commission. During the hearing confirmation, you can hear elements about her faith. And since you are a defense attorney currently in a church setting, I wanted to know how your faith helps you to continue in this work and helps you examine the ills of racism in our society.
Yeah, such a beautiful question. And so it's funny, you introduce faith into the conversation as my go-to for resilience. So it's so interesting. When I get asked that question, people will say, how do you keep doing the work? And I'll tell you, this is what I say: faith, family, fitness, and fun. And really, faith is right at the top of that. And faith is all about the recognition that we're in this for the long haul, right? And that we have seen God walk with the Black community generation after generation after generation, right? And we stand tall and we bring about change. We bring about change incrementally, right? And so you talked earlier, Pastor, about this book being a book for this moment. This is a book for multiple moments, right? And unfortunately, we're going to be in this fight for a long time. Yes. It's a repeat of the civil rights movement in the ways in which Black children were criminalized for speaking out during that era. It's a repeat of the 90s, and now we're seeing it again. And so when I talk about the long haul and being in it for the long haul, it's faith that God brings change, brings change even incrementally, and that I may not see it, in my generation. I do. I see it in you. But that I know that for generations to come, this work will continue to be done. And so I really do. I actually have extraordinary faith in this moment, and that God is with us as a people. And I think the last thing I'll say about, and I imagine this will resonate with you some, Sister Cheryl, that there was a time, right, when people thought it was crazy to talk about integration of schools. Right? And then we had Brown versus, Board of Education, Thurgood Marshall being a leader. And now we sit here today with Ketanji Brown Jackson imminently on the verge of being, our first Black woman, Supreme Court Justice. I think about my own work. When I started doing this work as a defense attorney, people thought we were absolutely crazy to talk about adolescent brain development and to talk about, impulsivity and, people were like, what are you talking about? That's social science. That's That's psychology. That doesn't have anything to do with criminal justice and the law. And now we have United States Supreme Court cases that recognize the importance of the adolescent brain and the need, the understanding of adolescent impulsivity, and that children will be children. And they'll grow out of it, and they grow out of it naturally. And so it is unlawful to execute a child, right? Today. But people thought we were crazy when we started talking about that stuff. So I say all that to say, we've seen evolution in the civil rights movement. We've seen evolution in the relevance of adolescent development in the law. And we are seeing now an evolution in the intersection of race and adolescence in the law. And so just keep fighting and hold on to the faith and engage. Activism starts right here in the church. So
Awesome.
great.
This has been great. Any questions from those in our church? We invite you to share those, then we'll go online. You can just speak.
Hello there. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm
Okay.
sorry. So we
Thank
get
you,
you on
Pastor.
camera.
Oh,
I'm
sure
sorry.
thing. Thank you, Pastor Roberts.
welcome.
And thank you so much to our guest author and our panelists, the entire book club, and the Fruit of the Spirit ministry. I'm Sister Sierra Tony, serving as a membership care coordinator here. And my first question is, we sort of talked about this in brief a little earlier. I wanted to know if you could speak to how this culture of criminalization is specifically affecting Black girls, as well as children who are neurodiverse.
As well as children who are
Neurodiverse. So children with special health care
yes,
needs
yes,
or educational
yes.
needs.
Oh, absolutely, both of those. So, with regard to girls, I was very intentional about, people would ask me, are you going to have a chapter on girls? I'll say, oh, no. Girls will be in every chapter.
Right.
I wanted to weave them through in every single space because so much of the implicit bias, explicit bias, the narratives and the tropes that apply to Black children apply equally to girls, right? So I really wanted us to see that, look, there are some unique ways in which, Black boys and Black girls are criminalized, but as a whole, we've got to see this as one. So that was really important to me. That said, there are some unique ways in which Black girls are criminalized. One, through hypersexualization, this presumption that, Black girls are promiscuous and free. You see that over and over again historically and still today. In some of the case examples that I give in the book, I talk about the ways in which, there were even officers who were engaging with young girls as if they were, prostitutes, in ways that are really, really problematic. There has been research demonstrating the ways in which Black girls are perceived to be older, more mature, less innocent, less in need of protection, and that has an extraordinary impact. The third way I talk about girls throughout this is the collateral consequences, right? So the decimation and the deep criminalization of Black siblings, Black brothers, Black uncles, fathers, grandfathers, all of that has a direct spillover effect on the health and the well-being of Black girls. So it's integrated and individualized and nuanced, and so definitely, thank you for that question. With regard to, I love your language, neurodiverse. I love that. I'm gonna start using that, y'all. But I talk about, I really want to make sure my language is sensitive, but in the schools chapter, right, chapter 6 of the book, I talk about cops in schools, and I talk specifically about the ways in which the intersection of racial bias that we've been talking about and cognitive limitations are really, for lack of a better word, they're problematized. So in other words, that if we as adults encounter a young person, let's say with autism, or a young person with a speech and language disorder, those encounters are exacerbated by racial bias. So the assumption that a child who is, let's say with an autistic child, has difficulty sometimes with executive functioning, memory. So my clients and their experts, their counselors, talk to me about, if I talk to a child sometimes who is autistic, he or she needs to be carefully guided, one step at a time. Brush your teeth. Now put on your pants. Now let's comb our hair. Police officers don't do that when they encounter a young person, right? With, you know, with challenges, if you will. And so sit down, put your hands up. It's not one by one, it's a race, right? And so a child gets scared, they get nervous, right? There are some children with sensory deficit disorders. And so loud noises, touching, things of that nature are very, very frightening for police officers. Police officers are trained in no ways to deal with that. We've got kids who have speech and language disorders who really struggle with the WH words, who, what, where, when, right? And so so you walk up to a child, where are you coming from? Where are you going? Where are your parents? They can't handle that. They can't process that. Again, terrifying. And so I write about in my book kids who are dealing with some of these challenges and how police officers, because they're not trained, become violent. They use force very, very rapidly. And you map that onto implicit racial bias. And so they're perceiving you as a threat, as a direct threat, and not seeing that you might have a cognitive disability that needs to be slowly, addressed. If you would just take a beat and pause and work with this child. So I think that's really important. I also think that this is another part of the police-free schools movement. Kids with disabilities are like multiple times more likely to be arrested and at school instead of engaged with someone who's a cognitive specialist or the like. So we have a lot of work to do in that area. I love that question. Yeah.
Thank you so much for answering it.
Sure.
And I just wanted to say it comes out of my own experience as a Black woman educated in a school for predominantly Black women, but also as the daughter of someone who works in health insurance for children with special health care needs. And just thinking about how those things are playing out beyond the classroom, beyond the church house, but really in the street. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for answering that.
Thank you.
In terms of some of our questions from the virtual audience, give me about 30 seconds here. We have one question from Sister Donza Poole. She says, you noted that young people can no longer be sentenced to execution. Have you done any work on the issue surrounding life sentences for young people who are convicted of a crime?
So, great question. So, not personally directly. It is impossible to be in this space and to do this work and not be invited to speak or to advocate for humane sentences. So I guess if that's the question, yes. I've testified before legislative bodies about various severe sentences of like juvenile life without parole or statutory reform reducing or eliminating outright the prosecution of children as adults, right? We as a community, you talk about an issue that we need to stand for, that is one issue that we as a Black community definitely need to stand for because Black children and brown children are so disproportionately overrepresented both in the transfer of children to adult courts and in severe sentences like juvenile life without parole, that this becomes our issue. That's what chapter, 11 is all about. It's about the dehumanization of Black and brown children who make mistakes. Yeah. Right? And so remember, when I was talking about the criminalization of normal adolescent behaviors, those are those behaviors I don't think should be in court at all, right? But even when you get to that last 20% that, okay, now we have an appropriate intervention, legal intervention for serious violent offenses, we do so in ways that are still humane. And think about like Kyle Rittenhouse. I mean, literally, I just can't not say a word. Quintessential adolescent foolishness, crossing state lines with a weapon, minimal to no experience really with a weapon. He, had that hunting license, but that's not what he was trained to do with it. And you know what? He gets in over his head and he says, he's got to take someone else's life, two people's lives, and severely injuring someone else. That's huge, right? And what happens to him? His mother and his lawyer, rightfully so, want the whole world to see him as an adolescent who got in over his head. He not only gets due process, he doesn't get shot dead in the street, but he gets due process. He gets a full trial, and he gets found innocent, right? Or found not guilty because people can recognize adolescence and how he got in over his head. So this notion is really tied to this severe sentences like life without parole and death penalty for children. We would never do that to a Kyle Rittenhouse, right? Like you wouldn't. And so this is what the humanization, this is what we have to be advocating for, is the elimination of those severe sentences because of what we know about adolescence, but also equity.
Thank you so much for that. We have some questions in the congregation. We have Deacon Sean Davis-Walensky here.
Thank you so much for coming. This is kind of an add-on to that. For those kids who are getting stiffer sentences, I'm wondering if those lawyers, judges, when they're in the courtrooms with those, and those judges and lawyers look like them, does that change the outcome when we look at the numbers?
Really great question. Here's what the research shows, particularly more with police than with judges, is that the racial bias is so deeply embedded on the question of criminality that even people who look like us still have those same biases regarding criminality. This is what I was talking about with the cultural shift, that every single one of us has to do the work of checking ourselves. Why are we afraid when we walk through a park and we see a black child with a hoodie? That people who look like us. So I say that to say diversity is important in every single institution in our country, but it's not the game changer on questions of criminality, unfortunately, because of that deep-seated bias. It's a really good question with regard, is that any different? My guess is the research is going to play out the same for judges on these questions of criminality. So yes, I want to see more, judges of color on the bench, but they've got to be invested in doing the work. Right? You have.
So I guess my follow-up question is things like training on implicit bias and those types of things in law school, in the bar, do those things happen? Are they being pushed more in law school right now to address kind of this bias that people have?
Well, it's
Black
so
children?
funny. I mean, this is a really interesting question. Some places are. No, but there's always backlash, right? We're in the heart of the critical race theory debate again. What in the world? Why are we? Why? What? I teach criminal justice, right? I cannot teach that course without talking about race. They are inextricably intertwined. And so this notion that race matters in every aspect of the law is just fundamental and foundational. And yet there's backlash. And this goes to your questions about white power and white preservation of resources. It's all of that, everybody's in such a defensive posture right now. Yes. So your question is it being taught? I think there are a number of schools we've seen that have made a declaration that they're going to introduce it and incorporate it into the first year curriculum, or at least make it mandatory before you graduate from law school. So there are a number of sort of forerunning schools that are beginning to do that and beginning to have that conversation. And then there are other schools that are just, hunkering down, and you get the backlash. So I think we're in the middle of trying to figure that out, I think is the question. Yeah.
This is great.
Thank you so much, author and sister. So happy to have you here and your great work. The school to prison pipeline.
Yes.
And commercialization and profit.
Commercialization, and what's your last word?
Commercialization and profit.
Profit.
Profit. There seems to be an intentional system, first, of course, of criminalizing our young people. But we all know about the prison industrial complex and the number of blacks that are imprisoned versus other races, and how that is being used as for-profit labor.
Yeah.
And so this seems to be just an extension, criminalizing our young people, 6-year-old with a police record, and then on and on and on, and finally as an adult or young adult in prison.
So I love that question, and I'll tell you this, when I get the question, I make very clear to say both and. You'll hear me say both and a lot. And the reason I say, so yes, a portion of what you see, the criminalization of black children, the school to prison pipeline, all of that funnels into some profit motive, right? Or it's driven by some profit motive. What I worry about is saying that that's the only, right, is that we forget this other piece, which is what we've been talking about, which is that even good, well-meaning people are caught up in funneling black and brown children into the school to prison pipeline who are not getting any profit. And so that we as a community can't just blame, as well we should, but we can't only blame the profit motive and the resource hoarders for what's happening. So that's why I like to say both and. But yes, there are still, shockingly, I think it's bad enough to think about the prison industrial complex, having an impact on adult, black and brown bodies. But to think that there are indeed some profit-generating institutions that are thriving off of the backs of black children is huge. You should read, there's this a book called Kids for Cash, right? Out of Pennsylvania. Folks heard about that. I mean, where literally the judges were getting kickbacks to send kids to a private facility. Hello. And there's a movie. There's the movie documentary, the whole nine, okay? So, I mean, that's just one example. But unequivocally, I mean, every single time, right? I mean, you think about the number of judges. I mean, you think about ProPublica, the story that came out of ProPublica in Rutherford County, Tennessee, where the judge was sending those 8-year-old kids. I mean, all of that has got some profit. There was profit for the county every time a kid was being sent to one of these detention facilities. So absolutely, it exists and it is real. It is not the sole driver of what we see happening today. We have to acknowledge the ways in which, this is what I like to say, that there has been all of these moments of intentional demonization, intentional criminalization of black and brown children. And in order to justify, for example, the lynching of Emmett Till, what do? You have to make him out to be a threat against white women or a threat against white people. Now, today, those negative images, those narratives live on in American psyche. The super predator myth has been debunked. It still lives on in American psyche. And you hear people talking about it now, okay? Even though it's gone. That has nothing to do with the prison industrial complex. So.
That's funny because that was actually one of the topics I wanted to choose back when I was in Debater about, prison and how they make money off of, the prisoners.
Yeah. It's shameful.
Well, I know that this is a rich discussion, and I know we're coming close to the end. We're in the church, the historic 19th Street Baptist Church, and we have been at the forefront of a lot of these civil rights issues. What is a word, a thought, a remark that we as the church body should take on this subject and how to move the needle forward for these young people?
I love this question. So this is what I want to say for the church, which is a psychologist friend taught me that every single child needs at least one irrationally caring adult in their lives. And that every child would do better with an entire team, a village, a community of irrationally caring adults. And so that is this idea that every single child is going to make a mistake in the same way that we did. And some of those mistakes are actually going to have really horrible outcomes for other people, but that we as a community can restore and we can rebuild. And so I think part of what we have to do is be that irrationally caring adults for all of our children. That's on a very humane, community-based level. But then as a church, we've got to get at the forefront of advocating, right? That our schools be irrationally caring adults for our kids, that our recreation spaces be irrationally caring spaces for our kids, right? That the mental health spaces, every single institution that serves our children has got to be that irrationally caring space. And so that means even in the criminal legal system, when a kid ends up there, how do we respond? We respond in humane ways. I want us to, as a church, to take up this 80% challenge, this idea of shrinking the juvenile legal system by 80%. That's what I'd love to see the school at the forefront of. So what does that look like in a very practical way? It means that we join the police-free schools movement. It is not as radical as it sounds, okay? It is not saying that we want police officers to abandon our children. It means that we need to be thoughtful about how we allocate resources. Police officers are still going to be down the street, right? At the drop of a hat, they can get there, right? And so police officers don't prevent crime. People think that. Police officers don't prevent crime, they react to crime. So we need to then, as a church, advocate for what prevents crime, which is the mental health strategies, all that public health work that I'm talking about. That's what we need to be advocating for, right? That's what prevents crime. Police don't prevent crime, and people don't realize that. So I think that's one. I think decriminalizing normal adolescent behaviors, we can be at the forefront of that, right? We don't need to see kids in court, for, disturbing schools, right? There are criminal laws in the book, like thinking about what offenses you would never send your child, or what behaviors, I should say, you would never you would pick up the police. pick up the phone and call 911.
Right.
We as a church have got to be on the forefront of advocating for that. So.
And then our last question for today comes from our online community. How can we encourage from Sister Yvonne Gowdy? In fact, the last question you just answered was similar to the question from Deacon Deborah Crane Kemp. But our last question is how, from Sister Yvonne Gowdy, is how can we help parents, encourage parents to become more involved in advocating for their children, especially in our school system?
Yeah, that's great. My hat off to all the parents who are actively engaged, in parents' councils at school. And I think what parents have to do is be educated on what the alternatives are. And so I say this when I talk to parents a lot, is that we, as parents, are also bought into the only way to achieve public safety is through traditional law enforcement methods. And so part of what we as parents have to do is to learn that there are alternatives out there. Asking the right questions, getting in spaces, inviting in guest speakers to talk about social emotional learning, mental health continuum, looking at models from other states and other schools as to what works so that they can be better equipped to respond to, the standard lawmakers' response, which is we have police in schools because for safety. So that's one thing. I think it's parents educating themselves about what the alternatives are. I think it's also to parents really sitting with their kids and understanding, asking those sets of questions about what does policing in schools look like, or what does criminalization look like. And for wonderful kids like Justin, maybe who've never, gotten reprimanded or reprimanded or arrested. Mom cracks up. No, I'm just kidding. But who've never been in trouble, looking at their classmates, who's getting in trouble and why, and how does that make them feel? That I learned so much. Like 2 weekends ago, I was sitting with a group of students, from a local DC school, and they were just sort of telling, what it's like to go walk through a school with a metal detector, or what is it like to watch your classmate get arrested, or what is it like, and they understand it and had good ideas. And so I would say as parents also is asking those questions, opening the door for a conversation like this, which is one that we don't often have, and asking them for solutions so that they, as parent advocates at school, can help create space for the young people to share those ideas at the school space. So
I want to, and we all want to, thank you today for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for
and in a real sense, a very transformative conversation. I've learned a lot. We've learned a lot just reading your work, as you've helped us to understand the ways in which each of us in society, right, have played a role at helping to criminalize our young people. And
that's true.
That is not a new phenomenon, but you take us back historically. so that we understand the historical roots of what is happening today. But as you don't just leave us there. This is also a text that provides hope and encouragement, that there is a role for our police. There's a role for our legislators. There's a role for the church. There's a role for parents. There's a role for the media. There are roles that each of us can play at helping to create an environment where our young people feel affirmed, supported, nurtured, so that they can be their best selves. And so thank you today. We want to encourage all of you who are online and you have not purchased your book, please do so. It is a great read. You won't want to put it down. The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth, Kris Henning. We thank God for you today.
Thank you.
We'll have copies of the book at the church for you to purchase. We picked up some copies of the book. So please call the church office to purchase your copy on Monday. God bless you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to our Fruit of the Spirit ministry for all that you've done to help make this possible. Thank you to those who are in person, face to face, as we gear up and get ready for our first in-person worship service next week for First Sunday in quite some time. And thank you to our virtual audience, those of you who've raised some tremendous questions, very insightful questions and comments. Thank you for being present, for being engaged. This completes this installment of Pastors Book Club, and thank you to our Pastors Book Club committee for your hard work in making this possible. God bless. Be strong and be encouraged.